Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. Great to have you back. It's even greater to have Hazel, my wonderful techie, back. The disasters will stop. Things you didn't see. Like last week, we were 10 minutes into the show and I hadn't hit the record button. We had to start again. None of that today. We've got a professional in the box and professionals on the panel. And we're here to discuss everything that's been happening this week. First thing, Lloyd unable to be with us again. A small domestic issue that prevents him being with us, which is not good, but hopefully he'll be back with us next week. And talking of next week, we will all be, the whole Prism crew will be in George Square for the Hope Over Fear 10th anniversary. And I hope to see lots of you there, but we'll be there and we'll have our wee gazebo there. So look out for us, we'll be looking out for you. So let's get started. Let's start away bringing in our favourite lawyer up there in Clackmannanshire. It's our Eva. Eva, how are you, my friend?
I'm good, Roddy, thank you. Delighted that Hazel's back, of course, and looking forward to a big week in Scottish politics. I want to see us rekindle that flame and that excitement as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the referendum this week. Let's not be depressed about it. Let's be positive and motivated, and let's try and inspire everybody, each other, to get back into that frame of mind that we were in 2014, because by God, Scotland needs that positivity now.
Here, we absolutely do. Well said. And, of course, to join us as well, we have the old Coatbridge Cavalier in Coatbridge, no less. Mr. Boswell, How are you?
Oh, splendid. Loving it back in Coatbridge. As I keep saying, it's the people that keep bringing me back here, certainly not the town centre. And I would say, echo everything that Eva said there. This was a momentous achievement. What we almost pulled off the impossible, or what they thought the impossible in 2014. But that feeling, that euphoria, that unification, that unity that nearly won us our freedom and will win us our freedom in the future must not be forgotten, must be reenacted. That's the only way forward, people. We need to stop the infighting. We need to stop those that would divide and rule us, which has been the MO of the British government and the establishment for a very, very long time, and need to continue to look towards each other. A wee bit of forgiveness and a wee bit of tolerance and a wee bit of understanding what's best for you and yours, which is an independent nation, of course.
Yeah, indeed. 10 years on, when George Square yesterday had a handful of Nazis in there. Only a handful, fortunately. But we don't want that. But I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our next guest, which is Alex Neil of the SNP, a cabinet secretary, a stalwart of the party. Even you ran for the leadership on one occasion, Alex, as I remember, because I voted for you. Believe it or not.
Right. Good.
I was one of your voters.
Aye.
I've done my brown nosing for the day. How are you?
I'm fine. I mean, like everybody else, it's hard to believe that 10 years have passed since the referendum. You know, I went to a school called Ayr Academy, and the motto of the school was Respici Prospici, which is Latin for look back, look forward. Unfortunately, I always say that Ayr Academy was all Respici and nae Prospici. But anyway, and I think this week isn't just about Respici, it's also about Prospici, because the independence movement's going through a rough time, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute or two. But the one thing that's absolutely now missing after the general election result on the 4th of July is we have absolutely no independence strategy from the leadership of the SNP whatsoever. And I think that now is the time when we need to really look at why we lost in 2014, because we've never actually done that. We've made a lot of assumptions about why we lost. A lot of what's been done by Edinburgh University about why we lost. And the leadership, I don't think, have even read their report. So we're going to understand why we lost, why things have got so bad in the last 10 years, put that right as part of moving forward. And we shouldn't give up. I don't believe that Labour's necessarily in power for the next 10 years. I think the way they've started, they could be out of power quite quickly, because don't forget, they only got a third of the vote in the UK, even though they ended up with a massive parliamentary majority because of the one fast system. So I think there is hope there for the national movement. I don't believe we need to wait another 20, 30, 40 years before we get another chance at being independent. And therefore, I think this weekend is about celebrating the referendum, and as Phil and Eva have said, how close we came, but also let us all resolve, and we need to unite the independence movement, not just the SNP, the independence movement, and let's try and resolve to move forward together. But moving forward is as important as being together, and together is as important as moving forward.
Absolutely, here. I echo comments of you all. And we might actually have that attempt, we might have that sooner rather than later, Eva, because it is, as I said at the beginning, Scottish budget this week. And the unionists, it seems, are ganging up, and they could, if they don't, in December the 4th, I believe, is the vote on the budget. And if they block the budget of the SNP, then there's a possibility we could have an election. And if that comes along, we've got to be ready.
Absolutely, but I think there's at least two things to take from this. One is that the Scottish Government needs to learn lessons about how to govern responsibly and competently. And that's where I'm very interested to hear what Alex's views would be in relation to the budget and what ought to be changed there beyond the proposals that John Swinney and Shona Robson have outlined this week. Because what's been sadly lacking since Alex's been out of government and since Alex Salmond's not been the leader has been realism and a real effort to make Scotland a better place. There's been a lot of really bad decisions made fiscally and generally by the Scottish Government, which could be changed if they took advice from the right people and if they listened to people who understand the economy and who know what works and who know what Scotland needs. So I think in terms of uniting the movement, driving Scotland forward, learning lessons, everything that Alex just enumerated there, we need to reintroduce competency in government to give the people of Scotland an understanding and an acceptance that we can govern ourselves well, because it was the very fact that Alex Salmond's government, Alex Cabinet, including Alex Neil, it was the very fact that they governed well that gave people the confidence to vote yes in 2014. And that's what we need again. We need people to be confident in ourselves and to know that we can do the job properly, that we don't need to be dependent on anybody else. We don't have to pass the buck to Westminster. We can take the ball in both hands and run with it in Scotland and make Scotland the country that we can be when we realise our potential, the potential of our people, we use our resources for our own sake, and we look after each other, as opposed to knocking each other down, which is all that we seem to be doing these days. We seem to be a very divided movement, a very divided nation, a very negative country, when we should be saying, look at all the good things that we have done, look at all the good things that we have already achieved, and how much more we could do. And this is where the SNP seriously annoy me, and I think most people in the movement, because when they speak about the achievements of the Scottish Government, in the main, they are the achievements of Alex Salmond's government, whether it's education, prescriptions, all this sort of stuff. And all they keep doing in terms of recent achievements is wheeling out the baby box, or the discredited notion that they took 100,000 children out of poverty with a Scottish child payment, etc., when these have been discredited as half-hearted attempts that have been overblown and exaggerated, because the people who are in government at the moment actually are not fit for purpose, because in the main, they're not listening to the folk who understand what we have to do in Scotland to improve everybody's circumstances and everybody's prospects. So particularly this week, this month, when we're looking at the 10th anniversary, looking at 10 years of what a no vote has done to us, we should be talking in the strongest, most glowing terms about what a yes vote would have done and what independence will bring. But we need a platform to do that from, a platform of success. And that's why we all need, within our movement, we all need to see the SNP do far better than they have done recently, to give people confidence and reinvigorate the movement and the population of the country, not just so that those who voted yes in 2014 can do so again, but so that we attract to our cause the people who are not yet persuaded, but who can be persuaded when they see competency and optimism and a real drive for change and a delivery of progress for the country.
Yeah, well said. Alec, Eve has pointed out there was an exaggeration over bringing 100,000 children out of poverty, more likely to be about 10,000. But talking of exaggeration, the Labour Party have turned around and tried to suggest that, Scotland's run up a £22 billion deficit while they're unable to borrow money to cover overspends and they're on a fixed budget. The lying has been quite incredible, trying to lay the blame everywhere else. Down in England, they're blaming the Tories. In Scotland, they'll blame the SNP. In Wales, they'll say nothing. And in probably Northern Ireland, they won't say a word. But the fact is the SNP have got to take some responsibility for some of their decisions on paying, on what they've spent their fixed budget on. But the reality is, if I'm not mistaken, since 2008, the budget's been reduced every year.
Well, first of all, can I say, Roddy, I think the Labour Party's got off to a really bad start, and I think they're going to be hung by their own petard. I mean, the idea that if we continue with the winter fuel payment for our pensioners, it's going to cause a run in the pound is for the birds. I mean, if that's the level of economic literacy in the Stammer cabinet, then quite frankly, they'll be lucky to last 4 years, let alone 10 years. I mean, it's just absurd. And it's also very unfair and completely unprincipled for the Labour Party to start their cuts by cutting the living standards and putting at risk, actually, potentially, the lives of some pensioners during the winter. If we get a rough winter, and the number of excess deaths goes up even more, then quite frankly, the Labour Party will get the blame for what they've done on winter fuel payments. And I think that's only the starter for 10 in terms of where they're going to make their cuts. So I think, and that's another reason why the SNP shouldn't give up hope, because I think the Labour Party, by the time we get to the 2026 election, and for Holyrood, the Labour Party's name might well be dirt in Scotland on the doorstep, especially amongst pensioners. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the SNP have dug their own hole, because in 2015, on the recommendation of the Smith Commission, they signed a thing called the Fiscal Framework with the UK government. They've signed a new one just a couple of years ago. And if you read the detail of that, and I don't think Nicola understood what she had signed, quite frankly, it's a trap. It's an economic suicide note. I'm not going to go into all the technical details with you just now, but believe you me, nobody, I think, should have signed it any way whatsoever that fiscal framework, either the original one in 2015-16 or the second one that was signed, I think it was last year or the year before, because it puts constraints on what the SNP can do to tackle the economic and social challenges that Scotland faces. However, I think this is the opportunity the SNP government has to get back on track. Now, I think the budget on the 4th of December, which Shona Robson is due to deliver, should do three things. First of all, instead of making cuts and stopping promises, programs like the free school meals for primary 6 and 7, we should not make those cuts, those vital services. Instead, we should raise the additional revenue required to fulfill those promises and deliver those services. And there are two candidates for that. First of all, if you put an emergency land tax on the top 6,000 or 7,000 landed estates in Scotland, let's say £100 an acre a year, and you could do that very quickly because you're talking about a small number of people. You could probably do it from April next year, October at the latest. So if you put that tax on, it could bring in up to £1.5 billion a year. Wow. That would mean you would not need to implement any of these cuts, and you could deliver on free school meals and other things besides. So that's the first thing. And that would be a very popular tax. I would actually use some of that money to reduce the income tax burden on the lowest income, lowest earning people. because they're paying too much proportionately in income tax compared to the richer people. So that's number one. Number two, if we had properly negotiated the offshore wind farm deals in the way that other countries have done, for example, if you take the European example, Denmark recently announced around, I think it was Denmark, where they took 20% of a government stake in all the offshore wind farms. We didn't take any stake whatsoever. Now, if we'd done the European average, we would have had about £16 billion in the Scottish government's coffers coming in. Had we just followed the example of what's been done elsewhere, had we charged as much as what the UK government did for the offshore wind farms off the English coast, we would have had 28 billions over a period of years coming in. Now, even if you take the lower figure of 16 billion, but particularly if you take the higher figure of 28 billion, then far from having a problem, you put that into a national wealth fund for Scotland, you could dual the A9, dual the A96, sort the A82, sort a whole host of, housing issues, house building programs and all the rest of it over a period, say, of 5 to 10 years, but get started now. So I would do two things. First of all, I would speed up the next round of offshore licenses, and this time do a deal that's going to be of benefit, real benefit to the Scottish people. There's a review going on of the Crown Estates. I would take over the Crown Estates. If I was the First Minister or Finance Minister, I would haul them in and tell them what they're bloody well going to do in the interest of the Scottish people this time. And I would also say to the King, I don't think he should be getting a quarter of the profits from the Crown Estates in Scotland, quite frankly. He's got enough to keep him going, and the quarter that of the slice that he takes should come back to the Scottish people. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is I would review the current licenses that we have issued in far too generous a basis, by the way, because part of the contract and the license says that they must make a serious effort to manufacture the blades and other materials in Scotland. Now, the evidence is that that's not happening. Most of the blades seem to be getting manufactured in China or elsewhere. So I would be going to these companies and saying, and I did this as the health minister in PFI contracts. For example, we reviewed the PFI contract at Larbert Hospital. This is 10, 12 years ago. And the contractor wasn't keeping to the terms of the contract. So we actually recovered millions of pounds on that contract as a result of their breach. They didn't even challenge us on it. We get the first instalment was, I think, £7 million back, from them because they recognised that they had not kept to the contract. So if they've not kept to the contract, we are entitled to go back to them and say, those of you who have not been building your downstream supply chain in Scotland or enough of it in Scotland, you've breached the contract. Therefore, the license is terminated unless you agree not only to keep to that promise to build the supply chains in Scotland, but also we're changing the contract so that from now we get an annual sum from you that we can spend as a Scottish government in whatever we want to spend on in Scotland. Now that might bring in only initially 500 million quid, but it's 500 million quid we don't have. And that 500 million quid could again prevent cuts or being, if you've already from the first measure get enough money, be invested in Scotland. And the third thing I would do is I would say to the Scottish Government, when it comes to the spending side, it's high time you get your priorities right. Let me give you an example. In the run-up to last December's Scottish Government budget, the Greens refused to take a penny out of what's called the active travel budget, which is mainly spent on cycle lanes, and said that apparently they threatened to leave the government, resign from the Scottish Government if the Scottish Government took any money off I think it was about 200 million at that time, the active travel budget. I personally would have said, well, there's the door. Because what happened was they kept, I think it's actually down to about 160 million now, but they kept that level of money in what was a cycle lane fund. Now, I'm not against cycle lanes, but they took 200 million off the housing budget. Now, if you're going to get economic growth, tackle climate change and tackle child poverty, you need a massive investment in housing. And when it comes to priorities, housing is a far, far more important priority than cycle lanes.
Absolutely.
Far more important, including for climate change, is more important. It makes a far bigger contribution to reducing carbon emissions and carbon efficiency than cycle lanes do, and it does it in a far better way. So I think that 200 million, which is still off the housing budget, take that money from the cycle lane budget and put it back into the housing budget. It's just one example of where you get your priorities right. And the final comment in the budget I'd make is this. There is a call in the press, not just the right-wing press, by the way, to means test social security benefits. Why do we not test all the handouts the Scottish Government gives to the big landowners, for example, including, I think, the King in relation to Balmoral? I mean, there's a project called the Peatland Restoration Project, 250 million being spent on it. And when you're subsidising large corporate companies and large landowners for peatland restoration, we should just pass a law saying that it's a statutory duty. They've got to do it. They've got the money in their own pockets to do it. Why are we spending billions over a period of years getting folk to plant trees? Why don't we just tell them and strengthen the land reform bill so we've got the powers just to tell them that they've got to do with their land what is necessary for the Scottish interest? And they might, some on the edges small farmers and the like might require a bit of a subsidy. But these people who are mega rich, these corporates are now buying up the land in Scotland. They don't need a subsidy. So why don't we means test them instead of means testing the poor? And that would be popular in Scotland. So there's 3 or 4 measures I would take if I was Fiona Robson in December. I regret to say, Roddy, I don't think any of that will happen because they don't have the backbone to do it. They don't seem to have the intellectual capacity to work out what needs to be done. And, them and their advisors, who in my view seem to be pretty third rate, need to get their act together. And if they started to introduce measures like that, they wouldn't be long in scalping the Labour Party into third place again when it comes to 2026. That's the kind of policy we need.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking we can finish the programme now. Alec, you've done it. I don't know where we go from here. Phil, you've got to follow this, actually. But on that, what you were talking about, fixing the lands for the peat bogs, I mean, if you look at open cast mining, for example, for gold in Alaska, part of their license to be able to do it is they've got to put the land back into the condition they found it. It's their job. They've got to take it from their profits to do it. Why we're not doing that, I do not know. It's ridiculous that the taxpayers actually subsidising these landowners to get away with desecrating our land. Yeah. Phil, as I've said there about that, the SNP have to take some responsibility, but as Alex highlighted brilliantly, there are things that could be done alternatively to lessen the blow here and, in fact, make things better.
Yeah, but I'm kind of taking a slightly different approach here. I mean, what you mentioned about gold mining, whatever, the same applies to oil sands in Canada. They've got to renew it. They've got to replenish it, recover it, and it's fabulous. It works really well. It was great listening to Alex. This accentuates the contrast between Alex Salmond's SNP government and Nicholas. The current SNP leadership cannot and must not be trusted. That's the problem I face here. The big clear out we keep talking about. We will give our version of the list of those who must not be part of the independence leadership going forward. Otherwise, we will be waiting another 10 years. So Radical surgery is required there. On the theme of where we go from here, I'm less about, and it's not the minutiae, these are great policies we're talking about, but an independent Scotland running its own affairs is a completely different animal. We adopt, I mean, oil and gas, my area of expertise, we adopt the Norwegian model for energy. It's a game changer. But without independence, it's just so much talk. You know, the talk of the details of a budget need to be framed against the reality. What we do now remains akin to rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. We need out of this union of unequals. Nothing else will work. Nothing. The reality of our current position, devolved and reserved powers, need to be understood. It's a very different position where you call the shots, but we do not call the shots in this union. Sadly, right now, we don't. We're subject to the whim of the Brits. Until we free ourselves from control by the UK government, we're playing their game. We are losing, and we will continue to lose. A reserved and devolved powers, what the Scottish Government can and cannot do. Look it up, folks. It's not rocket science. It's easy to understand, something Alex understands very, very well. But the Scottish Government is a big council. That's effectively what we have, and it's like just look at the little powers the Scottish Government had through fiscal and economic policy. The Scottish Government, what we've done, the Scotland Office have just been given 150 million award, so they can now step in, and obviously they're going to support Labour-supported councils and come to the rescue where the Scottish Government have failed them. And the reality is, because the budget in real terms is always cut every year, you cannot improve or even maintain services when the costs continue to outstrip your investment. It's physically impossible. And don't forget, there was a canny move made by Alex, one of Alex Salmond, one of many, during his tenure as First Minister. He was instrumental in changing the name from the Scottish Executive to the Scottish Government in 2007. Now, this worked very well for the competent government that he created and ran, as it proved that we could run ourselves. There was never any doubt, in spite of the constant criticism from the UK-run press. But this has backfired under Nicola's catastrophic reign, and its continuation under other assorted puppets of the British state. That's why the planned shambles continues and will continue under shysters like Swinney and Kate Forbes. I mean, reserve matters. Look up the constitution, currency, energy, just elections, financial services, immigration, taxation, trade and industry, transport. Read on. Understand what fiscal policy and monetary policy are. To run an economy, you need control. I would say it's about 30 odd levers, economic and fiscal levers to run it. Fiscal policy involves the use of government spending, direct and indirect taxation, and government borrowing to affect the level of growth of aggregate demand in the economy, output and jobs. Fiscal policy is also used to change the pattern of spending on goods and services. Fiscal policy is a means by which you redistribute income and wealth. This is a high level. There's less specificity here. It's more. There's two main parts of fiscal, right? Government spending and taxation. It's welfare. It's 40% of your annual GDP is government spending. Your transfer payments, your current spending, your capital spending, public goods. It goes on, and then you go into taxation, required by any government to raise revenue, manage demand, change distribution, address market failures, windfall taxes are completely against. It's not a good economic strategy. If you want investment, you need to set the ground rules and stop moving the goalposts. Last point is, people need to understand what monetary policy is as well. I'm kind of zooming out a wee bit to the high level, because unless you control this, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. So monetary policy involves the use of interest rates and changes to money supplies to achieve economic objectives, and that driven by the government. But since 1997 in the UK, monetary policy has been controlled by the Bank of England, who make decisions about changing interest rates and the money supply. The main objective of monetary policy has been keeping inflation in check. However, the bank also have the capacity to support growth and stabilise economies. And should that be in the hands of the Bank of England? Well, I think there should be a lot more government control there. But anyway, these are big issues and can be subject of a show on their own. For me, it's easy to criticise the Scottish Government, but what you're doing is criticising the rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic. HMS UK is down the tubes, and we need to go off as quickly as possible.
Yep, I agree with that, Phil, but you're talking about high level. The high level is not going to get us independence, because the people who are going to vote for independence, they're not interested in the high level. They're interested in, can they afford to keep their lights on? Can they put a plate of food on the table? Can they pay their rent, their mortgage, whatever? So while all that is very, very and very absolutely important, what we need is practicality, in my opinion, is what we're going to do. Because, I mean, here's a headline I want you to see, Eva. This one here, which is Scotland's wind power for 30. There's only 2.5 million homes in Scotland. So what do you do with the other 10.5 million homes? And we're getting no money for it. It goes back to what Alec was saying. We need to start getting money for what we've got as natural resources. And let's use the framework we have just now to improve the lives of the Scottish people by doing everything we can within that remit.
But I think that both Alec and Phil have hit the nail on the head. We need independence to do the job properly. Until we've got independence, an awful lot of stuff is just a sticking plaster to a hemorrhaging wound. But there are priorities that need to be reordered. Now, you know, in terms of the work that I do, I don't have a kind of average perception of the Scottish population or what life is like in Scotland, because an awful lot of the people that I come across at work are very vulnerable. They're in hugely difficult circumstances. They have health issues. There is health inequality. There are very stark problems faced by practically everybody that I meet in a work context. There's social work involvement, there's criminal justice, there's addictions, there's homelessness, there's care experience. There's an awful lot of areas of Scottish life that I see day in and day out that the Scottish Government is failing miserably in. And this is about priorities. And one of them, for example, would be the war on drugs, as it's referred to, or difficulties with Scots that are addicted. This is where the Scottish Government could make life-changing differences to people's expectations and to people's experiences just by listening to folk who understand what the jobs ought to be about. For example, Anne-Marie Ward. If you said to Anne-Marie, you're in charge of addictions policy, Anne-Marie, I can't give you any more money than is currently available. You're going to get the £250 million per annum that is currently being spent. How could you put that to better use than it is currently being put? And she would tell you in a heartbeat, because I asked her over and over again, and she'll tell you in the space of 5 minutes, you spend 40% on harm reduction, you spend 40% of your budget on recovery and abstinence and programmes encouraging people to become abstinent and to recover and to get their lives back again. And the rest of it you spend on education and support services, and she's bang on the money. Because what her type of approach does is it helps people to get better. In the main, at the moment, the Scottish Government's approach is harm reduction, where there is very little room for the prospect of abstinence and recovery. Education is beset with problems. Alec, you know this. What do? You speak to teachers and you ask them what needs to be addressed. And what it is not a soundbite or a fancy launch of a set of guidance from the Minister for Education, who says we're going to support head teachers who ban the use of mobile phones in school. That was a diversion away from what the real issues are. And the real issues in education, and there are so many of them, this is a programme on its own, but the real issues in education just now are to do with children who need learning support, they need behavioural support, and you've got teachers who are doing jobs. They went into the job to educate, but they're spending more and more and more of their time dealing with children who have got problems, who are antisocial, or they behave badly, or they disrupt the class, or they wander about the corridors, they become violent, they become disengaged, etc. You need an education minister and an education policy that understands that an awful lot of Scotland's children are going to school hungry. They're coming from homes where they're becoming disturbed because of the way their parents behave, or because they've suffered from trauma. And so we need, in every state school, a behavioural support assistant, a learning support assistant, a teacher whose job is simply and solely to get to know the troubled children, to assist them, to take them out of the classroom where they're disrupting others, let those who've been disrupted no longer be disrupted because they're getting a proper education, but overall listen to the teachers. And that's the problem with the Scottish Government just now. They are not listening to people with lived experience who can actually give them some of the answers to some of the problems and recreate competent government in every area of public life. You could go on, speak to police officers and ask them what's wrong in their job, speak to the firemen and ask them what's wrong. But in the main, the government's not doing this, or they appear not to be doing it. They're listening to special advisors, civil servants who probably don't have very much life experience before they went into the business of government. And sometimes it just seems to me that the government has become devoid of common sense. I mean, we've seen innumerable examples of that in the last few years. The whole furore, the whole hoo-ha about gender recognition reform, for example, the absolute debacle of the likes of Isla Bryson and the prospect of whether a man was going into a women's prison. For God's sake, none of that should have happened. None of it should have been allowed to happen. And whoever permitted that to occur and prolonged the agony was not a friend of either the people of Scotland or the independence movement. It's the same with the Greens and, for example, the deposit return scheme. There was a lot of different ways that could have been done and could have been managed, but it was all managed badly and wrongly at great expense, at great cost, because the priorities of the government were skewed, and they were really not the priorities of the majority of the population. And that's what's wrong. They're listening to the wrong folk, implementing the wrong stuff, instead of looking at the big ticket changes that could be made. I mean, I'm looking forward to Alec talking about housing, because the Scottish Government need to take his advice on housing. It is absolutely fundamental. And Alec, everything you've said about housing, everything you've written about it is bang on the money. And I want to know why John Swinney hasn't got you sitting as his right-hand man, giving him that advice, because your housing policy would be transformative in innumerable respects.
It is a fact, you've all said it, Alec, is that it seems that both in the Parliament in London and in Scotland, probably in Wales and Northern Ireland as well, that the elected representatives always go to the civil service. They don't always go to the experts, and that is a fundamental problem of our democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And don't forget, the civil service is a reserved issue. The civil service is organised from London, even for the civil servants who service the Scottish Government. And it's ridiculous. I mean, one of the things that should have been devolved is for us to appoint and set the rules for the civil service servicing the Scottish Government. And if the British head of civil service is your boss, then your first loyalty has to be to him or her. And there are very good civil servants, but there are also some who are not so good. And quite frankly, we over-rely on them. I think also, if you look at the advisory group, there's too much of a tendency to bring in young things straight out of university as advisors. They're not advisors. I mean, if you take education, the kind of advisors we should have, and this is where also I would reach out to members of other parties who have got expertise. For example, Keir Bloomer is not, I think I'm right in saying, a supporter of independence, but Keir Bloomer, neither will know Keir well. Keir Bloomer, I think, is worth listening to on education. Lindsay Patterson is worth listening to in education. I would have people like that. I mean, on the land reform bill, only 25% of the land reform bill is actually addressing the problems of land in Scotland. I would bring in Andy Whiteman as the chief advisor on land policy for the Scottish Government to rewrite that bill and get it into shape so that we could actually face the people of Scotland, particularly rural Scotland, and say, we've got a bill that maps the future of the kind of future we want to see in terms of the control over land and land ownership and the management of the land in Scotland. So I think one of the things, and this is well within our grasp, is we need to go back to what we did under Alex. I remember we were all very much instructed, almost on a weekly basis, by Alex Salmond to go out and talk to the people, talk to our own backbenchers, talk to people in other parties. I remember when I became a minister at first, there was a request in from a Labour MSP, Helen Eadie, who was one of the best constituency MSPs the Scottish Parliament's ever had. Helen was a great constituency MSP, and she asked for a meeting with me. And the civil servants came and recommended, that I be very careful and not meet her. And I told them, I said, look, she is representing her constituents. She is entitled to see me. She has been elected as a local MSP. And any MSP, any council leader, any MP, no matter which party they're from, don't even come and ask me if they request a meeting on a constituency matter. The answer is always going to be yes. Now, it might end up being a waste of time, but they're entitled to waste my time if they think it's important to waste my time. Now, in 99% of the cases, it's not a waste of time, because when Helen came to see me, I was able to help her, but more importantly, I was able to help her constituents in relation to a housing issue. And that's what we're there to do. So I think there's a culture change as well as organisational change. And, and the other thing, let me say, I absolutely agree with Phil. We're not emphasising enough. I think one of the things we need to do is to publish a 10-year manifesto. And the SNP should do this. And they should just say at the start of the manifesto, this is what we would do in the first 10 years of independence if we formed a government. We might not form the government. It could be a Labour government. It could be a coalition government. But if we were the government, this is what we would do in the first 10 years. I think this is a trick we missed during the 2014 referendum. Let me give you an example. Pensioners. The pensioners in the UK have the lowest pension in Europe. We should have went out, instead of taking a defensive position about the lies that pensioners were being told by the unionist parties, that if they voted for independence, they would lose their state pension. Instead of just taking a defensive position in that, we should have gone out with a costed programme to raise the the income of pensioners in an independent Scotland, let's say within 5 years, to at least half the European average. Costed programme. If we had done that, I think we would have won the pensioner vote. If we'd won the pensioner vote, we would have won the whole referendum. Mm-hmm. So we've got to give people reasons, but they've got to be rational, they've got to be costed, they've got to be realistic and ambitious. And let's not overpromise, but let's not underpromise either. So I think to do that. Now, let me finish with one example of the kind of thing the Scottish Government could do that wouldn't cost it any money, but which would help advance the independence cost. These papers they've published on independence are rubbish. There's no new thinking in them whatsoever. They're just trash and haven't converted anybody. In fact, I don't think, if you ask most folk in the Parliament, let alone in the street, nobody's read them anyway. But every year, the Scottish Government produces a document called Government Expenditure and Revenue in Scotland. Yeah. And it's basically, doing the unionist work for them, because it's a load of rubbish, because the press interpret it as the excuse for saying an independent Scotland couldn't pay its way. And it's got nothing to do with an independent Scotland. It's actually misnamed because it talks about government revenue and expenditure in Scotland. So what they do is, if you take the UK defence budget, they take 8.2% of that and allocate it as part of Scottish expenditure in Scotland, because we are 8.2% of the population of the UK. But the vast bulk of defence expenditure is not spent in Scotland. If you look at the research and development budget alone of the Department of Ministry of Defence, There's hardly a penny spent in Scotland. It's spent, you can argue, on behalf of the people of Scotland as well as the people of England, but it's not spent in Scotland. The whole point is the vast bulk of the money is spent in London and the southeast. And the result of that is we're all subsidised in London. So to say that this is government and expenditure and revenue in Scotland is rubbish. But secondly, when Derek Mackay was the finance secretary, he had a plan to publish alongside this GERS document, because he thought to stop it, he could change it a bit here and there, but he can't to stop it. But what he wanted to do was to stop the nonsense of it being interpreted as the economics of an independent Scotland. And he was going to publish a document which would have been government expenditure and revenue in an independent Scotland. And that would have shown a completely different picture. Unfortunately, as for reasons we know about, Derek had to leave the job of finance secretary. And unfortunately, and presumably this was a decision made by Nicola, because I don't think anyone else could have made the decision was taken to drop the idea of this other publication of the economics of independence, which would have been published and updated every year at the same time as the GERS was published. That was dropped as well. Now, I think that's a stupid decision, because actually that would have it would have prevented and certainly diluted the misrepresentation of the GERS figures as being indicative of what would happen in an independent Scotland. But secondly, we would be able to demonstrate that independent Scotland would be very viable, in fact, much more viable than being part of the Union.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a simple but great idea. But that is one of the problems, Phil, isn't it? I mean, it's not just within the independence movement. We have tribalism. There's tribalism is one of the killers throughout the UK and throughout our governance. That the tribalism stops good policy and getting information from people who, they might not vote for independence, or they might not vote Labour, they might not vote Tory, so we can't listen to them. That's one of the problems. We have to try and bridge that gap.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, and this is where it comes down to unification again. I mean, the subjects we're talking about here are key to this. It doesn't matter the nuances between how you would or would not approach a specific issue. The point and the glory that was the 2014 campaign, the campaign for an independent Scotland, was that we came together. It was every stripe, it was every sector, every church of every part of Scotland worked together and understood each other. We were tolerant of each other. We welcomed different ideas and different views. As long as you were party to the idea that you want betterment for our people and our nation, you're in. That's it. No pre-qualification. None of this woke crap that the SNP youth were trying to impose. You have to agree with us before you're allowed to be part of any movement towards independence. None of that. No pre-qualification. Your vote counts, and every vote counts, and that 100% is what we need. I mean, talking about there's some great stuff here. Talking about what was Shona Robertson and what you were saying earlier about, see that one about no decision will need to be taken on any independence papers. That blew me away, and what Alex is saying is, and Eve have said is bang on the money. Shona said no decision is going to be taken with the Scottish government. This series of papers on independence, will it be continued? Will it not? On the day, she'd cut 500 million from public services. And that's the reality of where we are. These cuts are coming down, and regardless of what part you are or what party you're in, this needs to be understood and this needs to be articulated, and the people need to understand that's what's happening. We're being undermined. It's the classic MO, modus operandi. Cut government service and introduce privatisation. It's how it's always worked. That's what's happening again. So there's only about 13 of these papers. They only cost a couple of $100,000, right? And as Alex says, they're very weak. And it's really the little that you're doing, Shona, The little the SNP is currently spending on the case for independence, and it is very weak. And Gers is a complete sham. That's a story in its own. This needs to be attacked by SNP, Alapa, and every independent-minded person. But even that pathetic attempt by the SNP is going to get cut. Derek Mackay's idea was brilliant. That's exactly what we do need. Gers needs shown for what it is. It's a construct by the Tories to discredit devolved governments and to weaken the opposition. That's what it was designed for by Lang way back in the day. So, no, for me, there's so many. Do you know what? It's coming to my head now. Andy Whiteman. What you said about Alec, what you said about on land reform. I know I'm jumping about a bit. There were so many juicy morsels here. The poor had no lawyers, people. Who owns Scotland? Read it. It's critical. What a phenomenal piece of work. It says it was a lifetime of work. Absolutely brilliant. If you want to understand exactly where we are in Scotland in land and how important land reform is and the potential you have for changing our country and taking power back into the hands of the people, read that one. He's on the money. No, unification is the answer. How we get it? Well, we need to stop the pettiness. We need to be able to forgive and forget a wee bit, Roddy. And most importantly, we need to work together. And those who would divide and rule us, that's the last thing they want. So it's the most important thing we should be doing. You're 100% right there.
Correct, because one of the things I noticed when Gers was out, Alec Massey, the so-called journalist, I think I preferred the description of a tenement journalist. I think it was John Cleese referred to the Scottish journalist as. But he said the reason that Scotland's got a £22 billion deficit was because we had too many public servants employed getting paid too much money because they get paid more than their English counterparts. And that's what caused the £22 billion. And it brings me back to the point I made earlier. Phil, that's the kind of soundbite they put out, and it suddenly becomes, because no one challenges it, no one can challenge it, it becomes the fact. And that's what the people think. And that's a constant worry, Eva, that the lies that keep getting spread that we'll get no rebuttal on.
That's a constant worry, but equally well is the worry that Phil just said the poor had no lawyers. We're in a set of circumstances now as the result of Nicola Sturgeon's government, prolonged by Humza and by John Swinney, that in many places in Scotland now the poor have no lawyers again, because you get paid far more money if you start work as a public servant within the Procurator Fiscal Service or the Scottish Government than you would if you were working as a legal aid lawyer in a criminal defence firm. There are massive issues in the justice system that need to be addressed because it is utterly shambolic. When you've got lawyers, including Glasgow and Edinburgh associations of criminal agents, talking about going on strike and having, work to rule and walking out and what have you, there's something seriously wrong. And yet the Scottish Government in the main are failing to address those problems. There are other problems within, for example, the Scottish Prison Service, where we know that prisoners are having to be released early because the numbers are too high. Almost every week, if not sometimes every day, there's headlines about, youths that are under 25 not getting the jail for issues that they would otherwise have been jailed for. And what's happening within the justice system is really what's happening in other areas of public life, which is that the Scottish Government have taken their eye off the ball and they're continually creating policies or behaving in such a fashion or allowing parts of government or arm's length administrations to do things that are just basically stupid because there's a complete lack of common sense. And I think we need to be back to having grounded government where you do listen to the people, you understand what the people want and need. And it gets to the granular level where you talk about housing and we need to build more houses. But why do we need to build more houses? It's because we've got too many people who are either homeless or living in substandard accommodation, and get down to the length of saying, what does that actually mean? It means that people don't have a roof over their head that is safe and warm and comfortable. There are, is it 50,000 people homeless in Scotland today? They're maybe not all roofless, but they're not living somewhere that's safe, that you or I would want to live in. talk about the thousands of people that are homeless, the people that are on hospital waiting lists for far too long, the people that are sitting in ambulances for too long or hospital corridors or whatever. Yes, our health service is performing better than it is in other parts of the UK, but it's not performing as well as it should. And we need to improve all of these areas so that the public see that they're being improved, and the public say to themselves, if this is what we can do with devolution, just think what we could do with independence. And then you write the manifesto and you hammer it home every day. You don't have an independence minister, you don't have independence papers, because you shouldn't be an elected politician, you shouldn't be a candidate for a party that supports independence unless every single speech that you make, every single one, includes the word independence, and you point out why independence is your mantra and what it is that independence will do for the people of Scotland. You shouldn't have to be told. We shouldn't have to be saying, write a manifesto, how can we talk about this more? It should be the first word on the lips of all of those folk. And there shouldn't be people apologising for talking about independence. It should be the opposite. They should be apologising for not having delivered it yet. You know, quick, if I just finish, if Alex Neil and Phil Boswell had been the leaders of the SNP in 2015 when 56 were elected, where would Scotland be today? We would not be in the doldrums that we're in now.
No, you're right, absolutely. And there'd be no through a Scottish prison. I mean, it'd be terrible. You have big trade-off there, big trade-off. But Alec, the one thing is, this is maybe sounding ridiculous when we look at what's happening just now, but I truly believe the British Union has never been more vulnerable than it is just now. Throughout the country, throughout the whole of this construct, there's low turnouts at elections. As you pointed out at the beginning of the show, Starmer in with a very low vote, a percentage. In Scotland, we know that about 700,000 independence voters stayed at home. There is this absolute fracture between our elected officials and what the people want. We see it with independence. We see it with what's happening in Gaza. We see it happening, with the winter fuel pay. Everywhere there is a disconnect. And if we could only find unity, Alec, and unity of purpose, I think we could push it over the edge, don't you?
Absolutely. And I mean, the annoying thing, there are two annoying things about what's happened in terms specifically of the SNP in recent times. And that is, every single one of our problems have been self-inflicted. They're not the result of anything the opposition parties have done. They're every single one of them are self-inflicted. The second annoying thing about it is, in the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 or 6, we have never had a better opportunity to move the independence cause forward than we've had in the last 5 or 6 years. Because fundamentally, the British state has been exposed. Number one, they're skint, they've no money, and they're in economic decline. Number two, if you look at the reasons we're supposed to have to stay with the big UK state, defence. But if you read the Mail on Saturday, yesterday, the Mail, the Daily Mail, the biggest right-wing Tory paper you could get, and it's saying the state of our defences is appalling and will take masses of money and a lot of time to rectify. If you look at the number of submarines, not just the nuclear ones, but the attack submarines and other types of submarine destroyers, and also destroyers and frigates and stuff, we are not in a state of readiness if Mr. Putin decides to invade Britain. The state of defence in Britain at the moment is literally indefensible. If you look at the riots in England, it shows the breakdown of society in many parts of England. So we are tied to a failed and failing state that's gone down the Swanee in the post-empire period. It doesn't know what to do now that it doesn't have an empire to filch from. It needs to make its own living. If you look at the balance of payments deficit, it's absolutely huge. And of course, the result of that, without getting into the technicalities, is the only way that we can live above our means as a British state is by selling our assets to foreign investors. And it's the only way you get the money to buy the things we need on a daily basis, because we're not making enough or trading enough. And this is no particularly Brexit. I mean, the fists they made of Brexit. I voted for Brexit. I'll not get into that just now. But the Tories made a complete mess of it. And, you know, if you look at the balance of payments of the British, the cheek to say an independent Scotland couldn't pay its way. Britain isn't paying its way. It's not capable of paying its way without selling its assets in order to fund the excesses of our standard of living that we're not making enough to pay our way for. So why are these independence papers not pointing that out? We are tied to a failed and failing state that's been down the Swanee. And if we were independent and doing our own thing, and it doesn't give me pleasure to say that about the rest of the UK, about England in particular, by the way, because it's not actually in Scotland's interest to be for England to be a failing state. But that's the reality of it. We need to do our own thing because we can be a very successful independent state. Have you heard any of that from the lips of any of the SNP leadership in the last 10 years? I certainly haven't.
No. St. Nicola of Assisi made sure of that. Because that's just on that way you were talking about of the ships. We've got 19 surface ships and 48 admirals. There are 6 astute submarines, none of which can be repaired, and they're all tied up at dock. So we better hope, either that or you better all start learning some Russian and Mandarin, folks, because if the Chinese or the Russians decide to come, you know what I mean? But just think of the restaurants we'd have. The Chinese came. Great. But here's on what Alex saying there. Why are we not saying? Because there is in our elected class, Phil, this fear of offending people who will never vote for independence, people who loathe the very thought of a Scottish independent nation. It seems our elected officials and representatives are scared to offend those people by giving them home truths.
Yeah, that's scary. But is that really the reason? My belief is apply Occam's razor to pretty much every question that you ask yourself. The least amount of assumptions that can be made are the most likely reason why something is what it is. And for me, it's betrayal, it's sellout. I'm not convinced. I mean, the bottom line is the establishment control the media. Something like 80% of all of the media outlets are controlled by 6 billionaires. You know, when you look at the decline of newspapers, but the rise of, you know, why is Elon Musk buying X or Twitter? Why are these moguls moving into social media? Because that is what we're using. The internet was wonderful. There's a lot of rubbish on it, but the truth is out there. The good thing about us using social media for our sources for information is at least we know the truth is out there. You will not find it in the media you're fed by the establishment. And so for me, I'm wondering about where we're going, where we're going with listening and continuing to play this game that Britain's serving up to us. Alex, right, Britain's in decline, but the main reason it's in decline is the greed. You know, but who's to blame for this? You know, is it Holyrood's the mess as we started with, or is it Westminster? Well, it is a combination. I mean, we even mentioned the philosophy we've been talking about for a long time. The experts, get the experts, teachers on teaching. That's who we should be asking. Economists. Michael Hudson, listen to him when you want to understand how economics works in the modern world. Spot the expertise within the Scottish Government. Alex explained it earlier. It doesn't exist. It's not there. Children's politics. Why are we listening to these clowns? Well, they're bought and sold for English gold. It's the same problem as ever there was since as Burns quoted it. But Westminster, for me, I mean, SNP leadership is failing to remove us from the grip of Westminster. That's their big failure. Westminster, because they continue to make cuts to the Scottish budget in real terms. The Tories and the Red Tories continue asset stripping the UK. The UK is still a relatively wealthy country, but it's being asset stripped, and and those who's asset stripping it are the politicians who are feeding their friends and masters in the City of London, the corporations, Wall Street. And the reason no one's critiquing it is because they own what we hear. I mean, another one we talked about, it, something Eva mentioned, one of Maslow's 7, shelter, housing, food. You control water, you control safety, the threat of the Russians. I don't. I'm like Sting in one sense. I don't subscribe to that philosophy. If you listen to the lyrics of one of these great songs in Europe and America, I don't. The Americans are not here to protect us. The Americans are looking after the Americans, and what we're doing with a proxy war against Ukraine is not in the best interest of the people of Europe. It's destroying Europe. And it's asset stripping Europe. These are big pictures, major issues, and we should not fear to rock boats and speak the truth. We ought not to do that. It's have the courage of your convictions and also be open-minded. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them proportionally. We should listen, read, and understand much more than we dictate. And we like to think we do that here, but we're not. We're not always good at it. No, Britain is definitely in decline. We're in trouble, boy, and now we're heading into more. And unless we get out of here, we're doomed, Captain Mannering. We're doomed.
Yeah. Well, I'm not scared to tell people. You just got to see the amount of people that ban me and block me. That's how you know I've said it. But the clock's beating us. But I've got one more question to end for you all, but there's a couple of things I want to cover. Because we've been talking about how terrible it is, and the Chancellor down in London's warning us how difficult it's going to be, but, hard choices, and the pensioners are just going to have to suck it up, and the poor are going to have to suck it up. Because, she's on 90 grand a year, but when she was on 86 grand a year, it left her financially short. Well, isn't it great? 86 grand. Can you give that to every pensioner? I don't think they'd be complaining. Or every single parent. It's just, and that was the question about the papers getting pulled. But the other one that got me was this one, talking of the SNP having lost its way. When I saw this, I was horrified. Nicola Sturgeon talking up Tony Blair, saying it would be kindly. Well, I tell you what, Nicola, love, history is not going to treat you kindly. Absolutely not going to treat you kindly. But the last question I want to give you all, folks, is this, because I was interested in this week, and that was, up you go. No, not that one. Sorry, hide that one. Where is it? This is it. See, this is what happens when Hazel's not about last week. Corbyn's formed a new independent alliance party, Eva. Now, it's for the left. He's already got 4 people in it. He's approached another 7. As I'm talking about the union teetering in the abyss, could this be something that adds to that? Could Corbyn change the way the UK happens? Could he become a force again, do you think?
I sincerely hope so, because somebody's needing to give it a right good shake-up. I was just listening there to Phil and Alec and thinking about what are the priorities of the people of Scotland, what are the priorities of the people of the United Kingdom. And, if you landed here from outer space, I've said this so many times, you would not have, for example, a House of Lords. You wouldn't have a monarchy. You wouldn't have weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. You wouldn't be lauding Tony Blair. How short are people's memories in relation to the war in Iraq? And he lied. The man was a liar, a murderer. He should be on trial. He should be in the Hague. He should be in the jail. So we need politicians who are honest. It takes me back to, remember that film, Jack Nicholson shouting about how you can't handle the truth, A Few Good Men. Well, people need the truth, and we need it now in these dangerous times more than ever. And I think that there's an awful lot of people would be pleased to see independent candidates, people of principle being elected, as opposed to, nodding dogs and monkeys with rosettes. That are guaranteed a seat if they stand for a particular party. Look what that did to Scotland. Look what that did particularly to our precious movement. There are people, you turn on the telly and you watch the Scottish Parliament these days and you ask yourself why it is that there are so very few orators there. practically every one of them, they've said it themselves, it's a reading contest. They stand up and they read. I made a comment the other day, it's like they're reading Dick and Dora and Nip and Fluff, but that's what it sounds like an awful lot of the time. We are very badly served by some of the politicians that we were daft enough to elect. We need to see people that are prepared to take on the establishment, and they're prepared to break down the doors and break down the barricades and make things different, because the UK, as you've said, is a failed state, but Scotland particularly needs a way out, and it needs led by people that we can trust, who've got the courage of their convictions and who tell it exactly how it is. That's why, Alec, it's been a breath of fresh air listening to you today, speaking your mind. I don't think that anybody within the Scottish independence movement and further afield would disagree with one word of what you've said. More power to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Eva.
And to you, Alec, could I put that same question? Do you think that, as we've said, it's a failed state teetering in the abyss? Could Jeremy Corbyn, could he, do you think, gain traction both sides of the border and reform this nation?
I think it'd be difficult because his alliance is very much an alliance based amongst English MPs, I think, Roddy, and probably in Scotland, if you like. The problem actually up here is actually the rise of reform, because if you look at the Sunday Times opinion poll last Sunday or the Sunday before, it showed that if there was an election just now to Holyrood, the Reform Party would win 8 seats. Now, I find that frightening, quite frankly. They've got no organisation, very little membership as far as I know, certainly no leadership, no elected members in Scotland at parliamentary level whatsoever, and yet they would get 8 seats. So I think we need to address that issue first and foremost, because I think if we as an SNP put forward the kind of agenda for working people, because most of the reform support is coming from working class areas, because working class people are under pressure financially. And this, abolishing the winter fuel allowance for all but pensioners in the very, very lowest income, I think feeds into the reform agenda, quite frankly. So I think that's more of a worry for us. I'm a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I don't agree with everything he says, obviously, but I think he is an honest politician, and I think his heart is in the right place. And I think many of the causes he takes up, not least in relation to Gaza at the moment, he speaks certainly language that I understand and support. Jeremy Corbyn's the kind of politician from down south that we could do business with, I think.
Well, that's what I meant. I didn't address it properly to you. That's what I meant.
Aye, and he's a good guy. And there are many people. I mean, Andy Burnham's like that. I think if you look, if I was in the Scottish Cabinet at the moment, I would be copying a lot of what Andy Burnham's done. I mean, they've just announced this deal with the credit unions to reduce fares for pensioners in the Manchester area. Why don't we do that in the whole of Scotland? It's not costing the public sector, to the best of my knowledge, it's not costing the public sector hardly anything. And he's put a cap on bus fares to help people with the cost of living. So I mean, I think we should be talking to Andy Burnham and people like that and sharing ideas. And the same with what's happening in other countries as well. I mean, for example, I think we should be talking much more to the Danes about their land value tax, which has been in place since 1926. The Norwegian pension scheme has just been reported to be the best in the world. Well, let's have a look at it and see, is that something we could do in an independent Scotland? The Estonians have done a lot on the tax system to make it, it's maybe not as fair as what we would want, but certainly it's very efficiently run. The cost of collecting taxes in Estonia is a lot less than it is in Scotland or the UK, is my understanding. So let's talk to these folk. Let's get new ideas, and put them into our manifesto for the first 10 years of independence to show that, with independence, we can really change Scotland for the better.
Hear, hear. Phil, so the final to you. Do you think that we could do business with a Corbyn-led leftish Independence Alliance party?
Well, where is the left? in British politics? The answer is it doesn't exist at the moment. It's gone. It's been deleted since the Red Tories continue to move to the right, and that's why Blair, touching on that theme, should not be celebrated. And Nicola, you ceased to represent the people of Scotland when you sold us out. So don't. She's irrelevant. Stop listening to her. I wouldn't even quote her. Is it probable that he could gain traction? No. Is it possible? Yes. He's an honourable man. I've spoken to him a few times. I don't know him, but I respect him. But I'm with Alex on that one. I don't agree with everything. Now, even though he adopted the Labour Party position on being anti-Scottish independence, we know he didn't used to be. And now he's not inside the Labour Party. Well, he's almost certainly at least open to Scottish independence. He won't object to it, I think, unless pushed. The other thing that's critical here, socialism. We mentioned that word there, not communism. Socialism. We need to regain control of our definitions and what our perceptions are. Politics is the management of perception. And socialism is not a dirty word, folks. It's an honourable cause. Fairness for the people, not Soviet communism. That's not socialism. So don't be duped by the attempts to redefine our history and the days of the ragged-trousered philanthropists. That's very much where Corbyn is. He's of that ilk. But what might stop him? I would say the British establishment. When obviously was at Westminster, I used to get the Arab Times and read it because I've got some Arabic and I lived there a long time. And my office manager was very pro Israel. And we read the Jewish Chronicle and we discussed them. We'd read them and discuss them. And within 10 days of Corbyn's election, I'm sure as a leader, an anti-Semitic critique on Corbyn came out in the Jewish Chronicle. It was taken up the mainstream, and we know what happened thereafter. And that for me is the scary thing, that you take on the establishment, you're in trouble, and that's what Jeremy seems to be doing with his independence motion, and that's where we are. And one other point that came out recently is absolutely critical. We should be aware of this and we should shout about it. We should be shouting from the rooftops. The arrest of Richard Medhurst and Sarah Wilkinson. Is the UK a free society or democracy? No, is the bottom line, because what we always got to remember is that restrictions on freedom of speech constrain your rights. Richard was arrested at the airport and questions. And freedom of speech, and I'll end on this one, is something we've talked about forever. Freedom of speech is the freedom or right that we use to protect all other rights of the people, and we must stand up for it, because if we don't have that, we are lost, friends. We are lost.
Indeed. You're right. These narratives get started, and most of them start in America and come across the Atlantic. Excuse me. I mean, the fact that the media in America are referring to Kamala Harris as a communist and Joe Biden as a socialist, I mean, absolutely. In that case, I'm to the left of Mao Zedong, who was obviously a Tory. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. Anyway, folks, the clock has beaten us, as always. As always, the clock's beaten us. And we could go on, especially Alec, you've been a fantastic guest. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And for you folks, if you're, as I say, we're going to be in George Square next week, the Hope Over Here crew. There you go. So it's the 10th anniversary celebration, and I think it is a celebration. And if you're there, we'll see you. But if not, until we see you again, you and yours, please take care.
Thank you. Cheers. Cheers.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.